On July 23, 2026, the House Appropriations Committee held a nearly 4-hour hearing on shutdowns. The bombshell? Almost no other wealthy democracy shuts down its own government. Only America does this to itself.
I disagree with both of you strongly. But Mr. McClintock, Congressman McClintock, you just said what I think is the real issue, and you said that no legislation or rule can replace political will.
Correct.
Let me speak just a little bit about political will. Ronald Reagan, as Jim Lankford just pointed out, was president for 8 years. Bush was president for 4 thereafter. We had 12 years. We essentially had 8 days of shutdown, or 12 days, 8 years of Reagan, 1.5 day average shutdown. Why? Because the political will of the president and the political will of the Congress was to reach agreement. That does not now exist. The director of OMB has made it clear, we want their funding to be shut down. That's a quote of Mr. Boats. Mr. Trump said we had 2 shutdowns, excuse me, this was Mr. Gingrich, 2 shutdowns in 1995 and became the first re-elected GOP majority since 1928. Speaker Gingrich pointing out that that was a successful effort. Mr. McCarthy said, nobody wins in a government shutdown. Nobody wins in a government shutdown. I've been here. He said that on September 14th, 2023. He believes partially he was removed for facilitating agreement between the two parties, rather than a partisan shutdown and confrontation. I believe these proposals do exactly the opposite of what we need to do, in the sense I think they weaken greatly the Congress and strengthen even more than has happened to date the presidency, making the executive extraordinarily powerful and the Congress much weaker. Essentially, it makes the Appropriations Committee irrelevant and powerless to carry out the founders' intent to give paramount and exclusive authority to the Congress for the spending of taxpayer money. Furthermore, I think that shutting the government down has been a tool of political choice by many Republican leaders, including Newt Gingrich, Donald Trump, and many others, including Vogt, and it is a tool which has been employed by Democrats as well. So no one has clean hands, if you will, on this issue. To Senator Lankford, I represent approximately 77,000 federal employees. I feel their pain. I know their pain. And obviously, that pain visited on not only government employees, but on others as well, is reflected in how many people are looking for a solution. But I really say that as we did under Ronald Reagan, I was here all 8 years he was president, and George Bush, we rarely shut down the government. Under Joe Biden, with a Republican Congress, we didn't shut down the government at all, not once, because we reached agreement. And political will, I suggest again, Congressman, is in fact the answer. Not weakening the Congress of the United States, not saying somebody else will get government going. The incentive for the administration to undermine agreement is heightened by, I think, these proposals. Although I would like to see the Senate, I'm one of those that thinks the Senate needs to reform itself so that it can do its business.
We're just applying a tourniquet to a hemorrhaging wound that's hemorrhaging more every year. I've been here long enough now. Look, 2 years ago, did we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Budget Act? No, because it has failed. Let's just admit it. Why don't we just admit to ourselves we actually need to redo the Budget Act? It doesn't work. Hasn't worked for decades. Hasn't worked since I've been here, 16 years. And no wonder, because the size of the federal government, the discretionary budget, has more than doubled since that Budget Act was passed. More than doubled. With $730 billion in today's dollars then, we're now at $1.6 trillion. The bottom line is these budgets have become too complicated to get done, given the limited bandwidth of both the executive branch and the legislative branch. So I will tell you, Ms. Young, you're absolutely right. We're just doing workarounds. The idea of a 2-year budget cycle for the budget, why don't we do 2 years appropriations? There's some states that do 2 years appropriations. We meet every year. If we have to adjust something, we can adjust it. But at least half the government doesn't close on October 1st. And except with the exception of defense, the idea that that a 1-year NDAA works and then a 1-year budgetary cycle works is ridiculous. The Ukraine war has shown, if the Ukraine government had an NDAA that they passed a year ago that said what drone they had to buy and didn't give authority to the government, to the Minister of Defense there for stop-starts, they would have lost the war in that year. When it comes to, and Ms. Young, you've said it absolutely right, the only real authorization, the real authorization bill that affects discretionary budget every year is NDAA. Everything else, we don't really change the law that often, so why are we changing the appropriation every year on schedule when we could, in fact, change it every 2 years for everything but defense? And I will argue that in defense, we do have to give the executive branch more stop-start authority, because we will otherwise freeze ourselves and we'll have a technology freeze that will serve us very poorly in defense and wars going forward. I do think that we should consider it. We should have, look, 74 Act has failed. We should start talking about how to replace it, given the current state of affairs and the size and scope of the federal government and the advancing technology in defense. I will tell you that there is another option. We haven't talked about the True Shutdown Fairness Act, which is kind of the compromise of, and Senator Lankford's not here, I was going to ask him about it, where you pay the workers, but you don't pay everything that's non-defense related contractual. And I know, and I'm going to ask you, Mr. McClintock, to comment on this, because, as we've grown the federal government, we have a lot of grants, we have a lot of things that go out that are not contractual, and if we just pay, and because the workers should not get in the middle of this. We should figure out what actually has to be done to keep the government functioning safely and preserve those if we go to a shutdown fairness or no shutdown act, whatever you want to call it. But that would leave some leverage over the government to actually do something. The workers would be paid, but grants wouldn't be going out. There would be plenty of pressure on us. So, Mr. McClintock, if you can just mention within the scope of government, why don't we subdivide some of that out?
Well, the fault, dear Brutus, lies not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. The Budget Act hasn't failed. We failed to apply the Budget Act. There's a story that Newt Gingrich tells at a time when a Republican Congress and a Democrat president balanced 4 budgets in a row. During a leadership meeting, John Kasich, the budget chairman, slams his fist on the table and says, "You show me where it's written in stone that we have to balance the budget." Well, at the next meeting, Gingrich brings in a stone tablet inscribed, "Thou shalt balance the budget," and they did. So again, that's our responsibility. We may have a lot, as Ms. Underwood says, a lot of concerns over how that money's being spent. We don't get to spend the money. We get to appropriate. The president gets to spend it. We need to get back to our job of appropriations.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
And that means getting past that blockage in the Senate.
Yeah, thank you.
If you were an alien and you landed across the street this morning and then stumbled into this hearing room to see what was going on with the legislative body of the greatest country in the history of the world, and you found out that they were talking about fixing a budget process, you would have to come away scratching your head. And that's exactly what's going on right now. It is a shame. It is embarrassing that this country, that the legislative body of this country that was written into Article 1 of the United States Constitution in 2026 is having this conversation, 250 years after we were founded. But here we are. So, Mr. McClintock, as you heard me say, I think that your proposal, based on the way the 1974 Budget Act is written, is the only legitimate proposal that could actually get us off the dime because of the concept that elections have consequences. And in the House, it's a simple majority. So if this is our basic function, one of our truly basic functions is to draft a budget, which is a reflection of what the winners of the election would want to do with the budget of the United States of America, then yours pretty much is the only thing that actually forces the hand of Congress, because it would give you a simple majority. Would you agree with that?
Of course I do, and thank you for those comments. Just back to Mr. Hoyer's point, I think this makes the Congress more powerful, not less powerful, because it makes it more likely that the actual appropriations bills that express the will of the Congress will be presented to the President. Right now, it's a constant parade of continuing resolutions. But the basic problem, though, is these are hard decisions, and they're going to be imperfectly, in any body, they're going to be imperfectly addressed. Benjamin Franklin has that wonderful line from the Constitutional Convention where he pointed out that when you draw a group of people together to benefit from their mutual wisdom, you also will inevitably get their mutual folly. You can't expect a perfect response.
Well,
but the processes that we have are meant to guide us to the most perfect that we can make, given our flaws as human beings.
Well, I agree with the principal details of what your proposal is. I also happen to agree with others that have proposed that we do something to prevent the government or the country from going through the gymnastics of a potential government shutdown, a la what we did yesterday on the House floor by passing a CR that probably is not going to be lawful.
The filibuster rule has been changing forever. It was originally two-thirds vote. They dropped it to 60 because two-thirds was too hard. And then they decided, well, we shouldn't do it for judges or confirmation, so we'll drop it to 50 for those positions. The appropriations process and appropriations bills are something that the federal government has a constitutional responsibility to do. And I think we have a constitutional responsibility to do it. The Senate ought to do it with simple majority. If they want to change their vote-a-rama rules, I don't even know what those are, but they could change those too if that became a problem. But I'm not optimistic that they will listen to us. So, I talked to my two senators and they don't like the idea. So anyway, but I
consider it a helpful suggestion.
It will be a helpful suggestion. I agree with that. And Senator, I agree with your proposal. I like parts of it. I think it's a good idea that puts the responsibility back on us to do this. But if you listen to everybody in this room, almost everybody in this room would say they're opposed to shutdowns. They don't want government shutdowns. We want to make sure that doesn't happen. And yet they continue to happen. And they're getting worse and worse and worse. And when you get narrower and narrower majorities, they're going to become more frequent, because all of a sudden, any individual can become a king. If I don't get something that has absolutely nothing to do with funding over in this bill, I'm not going to vote for this. And we've all seen that happen. Happens every day around here. That's a problem. But we even had shutdowns when we had some of our largest majorities. And that is a problem. And I noticed that Rosa mentioned the shutdown where they proposed funding everything except ICE, and we didn't go along with that until the very last. It was because I don't think you can pick and choose. I don't think that's right. And ultimately, how did that work out for you? We got ICE funded for 2 years, which I disagree with, because all of a sudden we don't have the ability to change and have oversight hearings of what the funding is for the next couple of years. I think that was the wrong thing to do, but we were kind of at odds of not being able to do anything else. And that's a real problem. But I do want to compliment Tom and Ranking Member DeLauro and actually Susan and Patty over in the Senate, Senators Collins and Murray, they have been working on trying to get us back to what's called regular order, what we all refer to as regular order. I think one of the biggest problems that's driving this is we haven't followed the Budget Act of '74. We need a budget resolution. We need to know what the 302A is. They are hard to do. I listened to a speaker from one of our institutes here saying, most members of Congress don't even know what a budget resolution is. I've never voted for a budget resolution. When I was a freshman, I came back early from my dad's funeral to vote for a budget resolution. That's how important they were. And then all of a sudden they became too hard to pass, so we stopped trying and we started deeming numbers. And the House deems a different number than the Senate deems. So consequently, how do you conference a bill if you don't have the same numbers? And you don't have the same numbers until the four corners or leadership gets together and decides what that is. But if Senator Murkowski is marking up her interior bill to $40 billion and I'm marking it up to $38 billion, how do you conference that? You can't. We need to get back to regular order, and I will tell you, we have been moving in that direction. I think Chairman Cole has emphasized that, and we've been trying to get back to having a budget resolution, but it includes other committees. And you talk about the authorizing committees and things that go in our bill that are unauthorized. I don't put anything in my bill that hasn't been approved by the chairman of the authorizing committees. I have to get their approval to put it in, or they could object to it on the floor. Now, is that right or wrong? I will tell you, one year I brought a bill down that defunded all the Endangered Species Act and critical habitat. And people thought I was crazy. The reason I did it, I was trying to make a point. The Endangered Species Act had not been reauthorized for 23 years at that time. It still hasn't. The authorizing committee need to get busy and do their job with the reauthorizations of some of these things. And that's a challenge we all have, but I will tell you, it is too many people in Congress, frankly, have forgotten what the word compromise is. We work with compromise in this committee. Our subcommittee, Shelley Pingree and I sit, as do all the ranking members and chairman, sit and work on a compromise trying to solve that. We have disagreements on what the 302B is. Sometimes they'd like to spend more, sometimes we'd like to spend less. So we have disagreements on that. But within the bill, how we spend the money, we compromise. Too many people don't understand what compromise is. That's what this place operates on, or should.
But let me start with you, Mr. McClintock. You talked about the issues of our authorizing committees not being able to get the job done, how frustrating that is, and how, frankly, negative that is. But yet your proposal deals with, in essence, appropriations, correct? For those that might not be clear, why is the appropriations process different than trying to force, for example, the authorizers who don't get their jobs done, with very few exceptions, to do that? Why the appropriations process? Is it the constitutional issue? If you would just very briefly
Well, because that's
explain
where
that.
the system is seizing up. To Mr. Bishop and Mr. McCallum's point, the president is not the central figure in the appropriations process, nor, for that matter, is the United States Senate. Appropriations begin in the House. The buck literally starts here. And the process that we put into place in the '74 Budget Act has the Appropriations Committee working through all of the discretionary spending. Once they're given a budget resolution with those limits by the Budget Committee, which very rarely gets done too, that's a whole separate matter. The point is, your work, you've always marked to the levels. You take these bills to the floor, we pass them after many, many hours of debate and amendment, and then they go over to the Senate. Now, what's supposed to happen in the Senate? The Senate is supposed to say, either send the bill back to us with their modifications, or send it on to the president. If they send it back with their modifications, we either agree to those or we send it to a conference committee and we have a discussion with them. But the problem is the system seizes up when we send the bill over to the Senate. Without 60 votes, they can't even take it up. So they don't send us their alternative. They don't send the bill to the president. It just sits there until the clock runs out, and as I said, we're then given a Hobson's choice. That's the central problem that I see in the Budget Act. There are a lot of other issues as well that get back to that question of political will, and there's no way around that.
Let me now, again, and Senator, thank you for your leadership and for being here as well. Again, as I said to the director, I'm always fearful of off-ramps, but that's not what you're doing, from what I see. You're actually trying to create a different pressure point.
Right.
And I get that. But let me then, but the appropriations process can't happen as a vacuum. You know, the chairman talked about that, about the things that have to happen, the budget committee, et cetera. Right. I'm not gonna restate that. How, and then going back to some folks who really are more interested in being celebrities and legislators, right? Because I will tell you, there are some folks, I think Congressman Frankel brought up a very interesting point, folks that maybe are close, they can go home regardless. But also there are some folks that might relish being here, not to get things done, because if you actually look at kind of what the impediments are, it's usually a relatively small group of people, right? Some of those, frankly, are celebrities. And so how do you deal with that aspect? To not create a system that actually empowers celebrities even more, to not get their job done, but to just be on television more. And so have you put some thought into that?
I have, in the sense that I remember saying to my constituents at home, I don't pick the people I work with. Other people pick the people I work with. I've just got to figure out a way to be able to work with them. We have a wide variety of opinions and 535 members, and some folks love their social media feed more than they love anything else. And I get that. That's just the reality of the society that we live in. My focus is the pressure point should not be federal workers and their families. And that's what it is now. And the argument is we want to keep federal workers and their families as the pressure point. And if we take that pressure point off and put the pressure on us instead to be stuck in a room with each other, we don't want that. So my option is, if not this, what? And I do understand the leverage issue. I've had this conversation on it. There are some members that have more ability to be able to fly on their personal expense to be able to come back and forth on it. I had somebody that serves on the West Coast that said, if you can move the capital to the West Coast, I'm willing to support this proposal on it. I get that dynamic. My issue is our constituents have to hold us to account to get the job done. And if the law says you have to be there and you have to stay until you get it done, we will push each other to try to figure out how to do that. We always have. The last CR got resolved when we all stayed over a weekend, and we all said that's not going to happen twice, and it got worked out.
And we've got a problem that didn't start anywhere but at the courthouse in your hometown. That's where it started. When I was a judge for 20 years before I got here, I had to call immigration a dozen times and say, my jail's full. I don't have any place to put my prisoners. I'm not going to pay for it. Send your people over here and get your people out of my jail. And they came in there and they got them out. Went on. That was immigration. That's what they were called then. So the idea that the counties should decide, well, we're not going to allow anybody to take anybody out of here, it's totally contrary to the way it operated for 20 years that I was on the bench. They were lazy getting them out. Now they don't get any help at all getting them out. So there's where this problem starts. And that's breaking the law. And after that, everywhere we go, somebody is slightly breaking the law again. And we're here now talking about funding this and coming up with it. I serve Fort Hood. I represent Fort Hood. I'm proud to serve Fort Hood. Fort Hood has around 15,000 civilian employees. The federal contractors who work for them are some of the hardest working people we got anywhere in our county. Could you explain how your legislation would protect the government contracts of these governors in these government shutdowns? What's happening to those people? First, that's my first question.
So this proposal actually uniquely does that because it provides the funding for the programming as well as the pay. And as we know, we just had a time where we determined we were going to pay employees, but we weren't going to pay contractors and we weren't going to pay programming. We had a situation where literally in the Coast Guard, for instance, the Coast Guard Coasties, they were actually paid, but they couldn't take their ships out because they didn't have gas because that was a contractor that provided the gas for it. They were getting their utilities cut off at some of their stations because they were getting paid, but they weren't actually getting any of the contractor pay that was actually going to it for programming. So what I've tried to do here is to say the functioning of government continues. We all have to stay here, and it is required in this. We have a quorum call every day. We cannot go into recess for more than 23 hours, so it requires everybody to be here. And I know folks want to be at birthday parties, but they literally have to tell their constituents, I left the work. That is not required now. Now, if you head home for a birthday party, that's not a violation of what we're doing. This actually changes it. It also takes away all official funding and campaign funding for travel and puts a quorum call here. So it puts us here at work where we should be to resolve our differences until appropriations is done. But it holds the programs, the contractors, and the federal family, the workers that are out there, holds them harmless because they can't do anything about us not resolving things, only we can. So the pressure goes on us.
Well, I'm hoping, anybody else want to talk about what their proposal does to protect the contractors?
Well, to your point, the continuing resolution introduces a great deal of indecision in contractors' relationships to the federal government. How do we get to these continuing resolutions? Because the good work of this committee goes over to the Senate and then it just sits there. Now, they're supposed to amend it to their liking and send it back to us, but if it can be blocked for lack of closure, you can't have that discussion. And then we, again, have the Hobson's choice. We either accept a shutdown with all of its devastating impact on the government, or we go to a continuing resolution and the contractors go from continuing resolution to continuing resolution, not knowing what is next.
I'll carry on what Betty was talking about. Obviously, our House Defense Appropriations Committee is half the discretionary budget. It's always good to see you, Shalonda. And we had many discussions in the past, and the frustrations that we have in attempting to operate the largest enterprise in the world under a continuing resolution or in a shutdown scenario, it shouldn't happen. And we've been forced to do this because we unfortunately have given away our Article I authority more and more to the executive branch and a dysfunctional congressional process at this point. And our global competition, whether it's China or Russia or Iran or North Korea, they don't have continuing resolutions or shutdowns. And so I'm sure they're amused to watch us go through this process as we attempt to make sure that the men and women of the United States military are paid, that we can operate our procurement process in an orderly fashion, which unfortunately is not occurring at the present time. And then we've now fallen back on extraordinary new ways to fund the federal government. We used to pass, appropriation bills, and if we needed to have a supplemental in order to deal with a conflict, as the gentlelady was talking about, Ms. McCollum, we would do a supplemental, and we would pay for it, whether it was in the war on terror through the OCO process or in previous wars. And reconciliation, I don't think, was ever an intention to give the authority to OMB to determine how those dollars are going to be spent. Because one thing that I think the American public doesn't understand is that the appropriators, we don't control the reconciliation process. The authorizers really don't control the appropriations process. And I would submit that the Department of Defense doesn't control how the outlays work under a reconciliation process. OMB does. They, in effect, make the final determination of what money will be spent for what. We can make a list of suggestions. They may or may not follow it. But that's what we've fallen into over a number of years. So how the hell we get out of this thing and get back to regular order, all of us, because this is not good for the process. This reconciliation process we're going through right now is, I don't think is healthy for us. And so here we are on potentially a verge of another shutdown in a time of conflict. And so all of us, I think this is a problem within the family, really, that we have to come to a determination that this cannot continue. And I'm going to go with Mr. Simpson said to my friend, Mr. Lankford, that maybe we ought to rethink the filibuster. That's your decision to make. I know that. It's not our decision. But it was never the intent of the Founding Fathers or I think of previous Senates that we would be held hostage to a 60-vote process in order to pass needed appropriations, especially at a time in conflict that we're in today in Iran. So what would you, how do we get, we don't have time to keep talking about this. We need to do something. How would you respond to that?
I'd respond to that we have become allergic to having bipartisan conversations, because the filibuster is not an issue if you're actually having bipartisan dialogue and you're allowing grown-ups to sit down and talk to other grown-ups and to be able to figure out how we're going to solve things where we disagree with it. The filibuster really came into position. Of course, it was part of the Senate rules from earliest days, and it used to be 4 or 5 members could actually hold the Senate hostage because they could just rotate around and be able to speak. In 1917, that was changed over to a 2/3, and then in 1974 was changed over to the 3/5, the current rule that we have now. I would say that we've had some conversation about this. My predecessor, Don Nichols, who was 2 senators before me, served on the Appropriations Committee in the Senate for 20 years. They never had a single cloture vote in appropriations in his entire time that he was in the Senate. The rules were the same, the behavior was different on this. And now we've practiced bad behavior so many years in a row. That's why I'm looking for, how do we actually help guide us back to this? Because I don't think it's just going to be a situation where we say, let's just figure out how we're going to cooperate together. I think we've got to be able to put some new boundaries around us. And the suggestion that Maggie Hassan, my Democratic colleague, and I have, and it's a bipartisan suggestion from multiple of us in the Senate, is to say, let's put the pressure on us to be able to stay here until our work is done. We all know how important it is to get home and see our families. If we were to say no one leaves this week until all the work is done, we would somehow find a way to be able to get the work done. But we don't. We leave, and the work is undone, and the pressure goes on federal employees. We're trying to solve that.
Thank you. I yield back.
I want to start first with you, Senator Lankford. There's a lot in your bill that appeals to me, particularly the fact that it puts the onus on Congress and the punishment and the pain on us and not on the American people. Because 7 days here with all of my colleagues, as much as I love each one, followed by another 7 and another 7, would probably drive me to a solution as quickly as I can. But there's also other causes of delay in this deal, and I'll give you an example. We're supposed to get a presidential budget by February 15th. We do not. Now, the first year of any presidency, I understand that. They don't even have their own people in place by February 15th. But the second and third years, I don't find much excuse. We got it this year, April 1st, something like that. It's weeks late. We're also supposed to have a top-line number from the congressional, Budget Committee. I don't think we've gotten that in at least 6 Congresses on either side. It was so divided when Speaker Pelosi was Speaker that Democrats could not literally get a budget out of their own budget committee, let alone across the floor, and she had to deem a budget. So we've got other players in this that set us behind and make life very difficult. Is there anything in your legislation that would force them to get their stuff to us here in a fashion that would actually give us the time to do our jobs?
There is not on that particular area. We tried to stay very, very narrowly focused on just working on preventing government shutdowns. I would be eager for us to reopen the 1974 Budget Act and to be able to re-examine when the president's budget's delivered, what we actually operate with that. Quite frankly, this is a totally different subject, but I'm a fan of having calendar year rather than fiscal year. We need to admit the obvious gravity that every year we're fighting this in October, November, and December. This is now our 30th year that we don't have appropriations done on time. for
Well,
September
again, I
30th.
would-
But that's a different issue than what this is trying to address.
No, it's an important issue, but I would point, I mean, this committee actually proceeded
Yep.
this year. We did not wait on the president's budget. I wish we had it, but if they can't get it here on time, then it's going to become less relevant in consideration. We did not wait on the budget committee. I wish they had their deal, and I had very specific, look, we have a great relationship. I'm not critical of the committee, but I told the chairman of the committee, if you can't pass it across the floor, I'm not writing 12 bills to a number that's out of committee, because if you can't pass it on the floor, I can't write 12 bills that'll pass the floor. And so, you know, we've been flying on our own a little bit here and sort of backing into a top line, doing what we can as we can and moving ahead. But that's not a good way to proceed. So that's something, if you, any of you have additional thoughts on how we get the people that are supposed to do their job so that we can do our job to do it in time, because they always escape the blame. If I'm left, but Representative McClintock, I do have a question for you, and it really applies in a sense to Senator Lankford's proposal as well. Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution grants each Chamber of Congress the sole, quote, the sole and exclusive right to determine the rules of its proceedings. Given that, how can we impose upon the Senate, or even ourselves, or the colleagues, through statute, you know, you will proceed in this way? A lot of us have problems with the filibuster. On both sides, just depends on who happens to be using it. But really, a lot of us do have those problems. But again, how would we constitutionally force the United States Senate to do something your proposal envisions, which is, you know, you can't have this artificial barrier here that does foul up the process, no question.
Yeah, well, the answer is you can't. The Senate has this annoying tendency to not see things our way. But this changes a statute that requires the consent of both houses and the president's approval. So the Senate does get a say in this. They get to either pass it, modify it, or reject it.
Thank you.
Let's break down a House Appropriations Committee hearing with an unusually honest title, Funding Lapses, Analyzing Shutdown Reform. In plain English, the people who control the government's money sat down to ask why the government keeps lurching toward shutdowns and whether the process itself can be fixed. And here's the rare part. This wasn't really Republicans versus Democrats. It was a room mostly agreeing the system is broken and disagreeing about whether new rules can fix it. Here's the frame. One camp argued for changing the rules so a shutdown simply can't happen, most notably an automatic funding backstop that keeps the lights on while Congress finishes its work. The other camp warned that removing the pain of a shutdown removes the only thing that ever forces Congress to act. A fair check takes both seriously, because this isn't a fight between good guys and villains. It's a genuine disagreement about human incentives. So set the two instincts side by side. The reform instinct says shutdowns are self-inflicted harm, so build a system where they're impossible. The skeptic instinct says the threat of a shutdown is the deadline that makes lawmakers negotiate, and without it, nothing gets done. This breakdown checks each against how the budget process actually works, not the slogans. One ground rule. This is process wonkery, but it decides whether your national parks close, whether federal workers get paid, and whether the military can plan, so we'll keep it concrete and fair. We're not here to tell you shutdowns are good or that reform is a trick. We're checking what's verifiable, how the process broke, what the main proposal actually does, and what each side's strongest argument really is. Start with the striking amount everyone in the room actually agreed on. This was the surprise, near-unanimous agreement that the budget process has failed. Congressman Steve Womack put it vividly, saying that an alien landing on Earth and wandering into this hearing would scratch its head at how the greatest country in the world runs its finances. Members from both parties agreed the current approach, lurching from deadline to deadline, is no way to fund the government. That shared diagnosis is the foundation of everything that follows. And both sides agreed the harm is real. A government shutdown furloughs hundreds of thousands of federal workers, delays services, rattles the economy, and, as several members noted, punishes the public for a failure that belongs to Congress. Nobody in that room defended shutdowns. The disagreement was never about whether shutdowns are bad. It was about the cure and whether the cure has a hidden cost of its own. So how did we get here? A quick, honest tour of what actually broke. Here's the origin. Congress set up its modern budget process back in 1974, with a clear timeline and 12 separate appropriations bills meant to be passed every year. On paper, it's orderly. In practice, Congress almost never passes all 12 on time. Congressman Andy Harris was blunt about it, saying the 1974 law has failed and that they should just admit it and redo the whole thing rather than keep patching it. So what happens instead? Congress governs by stopgap. When the 12 bills aren't ready, lawmakers pass a continuing resolution, a temporary measure that keeps funding at last year's levels, or they bundle everything into one giant omnibus bill at the last minute. Both are widely disliked because they replace deliberate choices with autopilot and brakemanship. This pattern, not any single shutdown, is the real dysfunction the hearing was about. And it's not costless, especially for planning. Congressman Ken Calvert, who works on defense funding, pointed out that running the largest enterprise in the world, the U.S. military, under a continuing resolution is genuinely damaging because a stopgap freezes money at old levels and blocks new programs from starting. A CR isn't a neutral pause. For agencies that need to plan ahead, it's a year of standing still. Now the main fix on the table, make a shutdown mechanically impossible. The centerpiece was a proposal from Senator James Lankford, who testified. The idea is an automatic continuing resolution. If Congress misses its deadline, funding doesn't stop. It continues automatically at existing levels, so there's no shutdown and no furloughs. Crucially, it pairs that with pressure on Congress itself. Lawmakers would be kept in session, barred from recess and travel, until they finish the job. The pain moves from the public to the politicians. Chairman Tom Cole gave that idea a warm reception, and his reasoning is the strongest case for it. He said what appeals to him is that it puts the onus and the pain on Congress, not on the American people, imagining being stuck in the Capitol with his colleagues week after week until a deal is done. That's the elegant core of the reform. Keep the deadline's pressure, but stop making innocent people the hostages. And give the reform its full due, because the humane argument is powerful. A federal worker living paycheck to paycheck shouldn't lose their income because two parties can't agree. A cancer patient shouldn't have their research grant frozen. A small business shouldn't stall waiting on a shuttered agency. If you can keep all of that running while still forcing Congress to negotiate, that genuinely looks like a win with few obvious losers. Now the serious case against it, because thoughtful people in the room pushed back. Here's the core worry. A deadline only works if something bad happens when you miss it. Take away the shutdown, and critics argue you've removed the one forcing function that ever makes Congress finish. The fear is that an automatic backstop quietly becomes permanent. Funding runs on last year's numbers forever. Nobody makes the hard choices, and the dysfunction is no longer visible enough to fix. You don't solve the problem, you hide it. And there's a substantive cost hiding in that backstop. If automatic funding just extends last year's levels, then priorities never update. New needs go unfunded. Outdated programs keep their money, and, as Calvert warned about defense, agencies get frozen in place. So the skeptics aren't defending shutdowns. They're warning that a permanent autopilot could be its own slow-motion failure, less dramatic than a shutdown but harder to ever escape. The most memorable version of this skepticism came from Congressman Steny Hoyer, one of the senior Democrats present. He said he disagreed strongly with the witnesses and seized on a line from Congressman Tom McClintock that no legislation or rule can replace political will. Hoyer's point was that the real problem isn't the absence of a clever rule. It's the absence of the will to compromise, and no procedure can manufacture that. That's a genuinely deep objection, and it deserves respect. Every procedural reform assumes that if you get the incentives right, behavior follows. But if the underlying problem is that the two parties simply don't want to agree, then even a well-designed backstop just changes the shape of the standoff without ending it. The honest reform answer is that better rules can't create will, but they can stop the public from being punished while the will is missing. Both things can be true. And underneath the shutdown question sat a bigger one: rewrite the whole system. Congressman Harris pushed the most radical view: stop patching and rewrite the 1974 budget law entirely. There's a real case there because a process that fails almost every year may be beyond tinkering. But rewriting the budget process is a massive undertaking that itself requires the very political agreement that's missing, which is why, for all the frustration, it rarely happens. The appetite to blow it up is real. The path to doing it is not. Others focused on narrower mechanics. Congressman Mike Simpson walked through how the Senate's 60-vote threshold shapes appropriations, noting how those rules have shifted over time and how they force the parties to deal with each other. Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart pressed on the difference between the committees that authorize programs and the ones that fund them, a distinction most people never see, but that's central to why bills stall. The dysfunction, in other words, has many separate moving parts. And a note on tone worth crediting. For a hearing about a broken and maddening system, the exchanges were mostly substantive, with members from both parties engaging the witnesses' ideas rather than scoring points. That itself is a quiet data point. When the cameras are on a genuinely bipartisan frustration, Congress can actually sound like a deliberative body. The tragedy the hearing kept circling is that this same body struggles to turn that agreement into a bill. A little history, because shutdowns weren't always a normal part of American life. Funding gaps that actually close the government are a relatively modern phenomenon, and they've grown into a recurring ritual. The longest on record stretched about 35 days, from late 2018 into early 2019. The point isn't the exact tally, it's that lurching to the brink has become a habit, repeated every few years. Habits feel permanent, but they were chosen, which means they can be unchosen. And the cost is close to pure waste. Independent analysts have found that shutdowns drain billions of dollars in lost productivity, and that federal workers are eventually paid in full for work they were legally barred from doing, so taxpayers buy nothing for the money. A shutdown doesn't save a dime. It spends money to produce delay, anxiety, and lost output. That's the fact that makes even skeptics uncomfortable defending them. Make the harm concrete. In a shutdown, workers deemed essential, like air traffic controllers and border agents, must show up without pay, while others are sent home. Contractors frequently never recover their lost income at all. Passports, permits, small business loans, scientific research, and national parks stall. The people least responsible for the standoff absorb the most damage, which is precisely the injustice the reform is trying to fix. So why do shutdowns happen at all? One word: leverage. Here's the honest mechanism. A shutdown happens when funding lapses, and funding usually lapses because one side attaches demands to a must-pass bill and the other refuses to accept them. The shutdown is the pressure tactic. Hold the entire government's operations hostage to win a specific fight. Understanding that is the key to the whole debate, because it explains what the reform is really trying to take away. Which is why the central objection cuts both ways at once. Skeptics call the shutdown threat a forcing function that makes Congress act. Critics call the exact same thing hostage-taking that harms the public. It is genuinely both, depending on where you stand, because it's the same mechanism seen from two sides. A fair account admits that the leverage everyone wants to keep is also the leverage that causes the damage. One quick clarification, because people mix these up. A government shutdown, a lapse in spending authority, is not the same as the debt ceiling, which is the legal limit on federal borrowing. Both are forms of brinkmanship, but they're different levers with different stakes. This hearing was about the spending side, the appropriations process, not the debt limit. Keeping them straight matters for judging any reform. And here's a detail that quietly proves Hoyer's point. This reform isn't new. Automatic funding ideas like the one discussed have been floated for years by members of both parties, often with bipartisan co-sponsors, and they keep failing to become law. That track record is itself evidence for the skeptic's deeper claim. The barrier has never been a shortage of clever proposals. It's that giving up the shutdown means giving up leverage, and neither side will disarm first. The idea isn't missing. The will is. There's also a deeper diagnosis some witnesses pressed, associated with Congressman Tom McClintock, that the rot starts upstream, with authorizing committees that no longer do their basic job, so everything gets jammed into a few must-pass funding bills at the last minute. If that's right, then fixing the shutdown alone treats a symptom while the underlying disease, a legislative process that has stopped legislating, goes untreated. And a mirror worth holding up. Most other wealthy democracies simply don't have government shutdowns because their systems either fund unautomatically or resolve the standoff another way. The United States is genuinely unusual in periodically closing its own government over a budget dispute. That comparison quietly supports the reformers. If nearly everyone else avoids this, it's likely a fixable design choice, not an unavoidable fact of self-government. Before we close, let's give each side its strongest, fairest case. Give the reformers their due. Shutdowns are a uniquely stupid form of self-harm, in which a governing body punishes the citizens it serves to gain leverage over itself. Building a system where the essential functions never stop, while keeping real pressure on lawmakers to finish, is a serious and humane idea. The burden of dysfunction should fall on the people causing it, not on a park ranger or an air traffic controller. Now give the skeptics their due. Incentives are stubborn, and a deadline without teeth is just a suggestion. If removing the shutdown quietly locks in autopilot spending and lets Congress avoid its hardest choices forever, the reform could entrench the very dysfunction it aims to cure. And Hoyer's deeper point stands. The missing ingredient is the will to compromise, and no clever mechanism conjures that out of thin air. And notice how close they actually are. Both sides agree the process is broken, agree shutdowns harm the public, and agree Congress should bear the consequences of its own failures. The live disagreement is narrow and empirical, whether an automatic backstop would spur action or smother it. That's the kind of question you could actually test, with sunset clauses and trial runs, if the goal were truth rather than a talking point. So let's total it up honestly across the whole hearing. Here's the fair scorecard. The budget process is broadly acknowledged to be broken, and that's not partisan. Shutdowns cause real harm, and no one defended them. The automatic backstop idea genuinely spares the public and keeps pressure on Congress. The serious objection that it could remove the forcing function and freeze priorities is real and unresolved. And the deepest problem, a shortage of political will, is one no rule can fully fix. So where does it leave us? With something rare in Washington, a genuine bipartisan agreement about a problem and an honest disagreement about the solution. The question isn't whether the system is broken. Everyone said it is. The question is whether you can design your way out of a problem that is partly about design and partly about willpower. Reasonable people answered that differently, and for once they mostly did it in good faith. Watch 3 things from here. First, whether any version of the automatic backstop bill actually moves or dies quietly like most process reforms. Second, whether it includes a sunset or a trial period, which is how you'd honestly test the skeptics' fears. And third, whether Congress passes its funding bills on time this year, because the simplest proof that the process can work is watching it work once. Those outcomes, not the hearing, are the real story. Because a shutdown is never really about a calendar date. It's about whether a self-governing people can make its own government do the basic job of funding itself. The rules can help or hurt, but in the end, someone has to choose to govern. That's the work, and it happens long after the hearing ends. That's where we'll keep watching. That is our breakdown. Stay with us.